Well, hi there. I'm joined today with my very good mate, Pierre, with whom I served in the border war in the South African Defence Force in the South African Army. 40 years ago, Pierre, I think next month was probably the time when we first connected. Welcome. Really, really good to have you here for this chat.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. It's great that we've still been or still are in contact after all these years, and that you are prepared to have a chat with me on these podcasts.
Absolutely, Pierre, and I couldn't think of a better person to start it off with. We were both conscripted for 2 years, starting in 1981, and after our 2 years, we kind of lost connection, and then we found each other a few years ago. It's been really great reconnecting with you and reminiscing and talking about the good times and the bad times. Yeah, so perhaps we should turn to our conscription to the army now. Now, what intrigues me is that, from my understanding, you were in Namibia at the time, and yet you were called up to go into the South African Army. So how did that work? And then to where were you called up, and how did you wind up at the 6th South African Infantry training camp, where I was in the latter half of 1981? And how did we wind up in the same platoon together?
Okay, yeah, Steve. Although all my schooling, my formative years were in what's now Namibia, I'm still a South African citizen. So at the end of 1979, although I received my call-up papers before 78, I think, my dad was also transferred down then to be director of veterinary services at the Eastern Cape, and he was based initially in East London. So that's where I was. I got on the train in East London, and my first call-up was 8 Side. I was going to 8 Side. I was actually quite chuffed about it, because the little bit I heard about 8 Side was a tough place. So here we go again.
Uppington.
Yeah. Uppington, that's right. So I thought, here we go. I can try and prove myself. Short man syndrome, us shorties. So I ended up there wearing an overall for a month, because we didn't get browns. We got overalls there. And the guys came around, obviously, as they do towards the end of your basics, and you can choose. You can do the selection courses. So I did the selection for BATS, I did the selection for Reconnaissance Commander, and I did the selection for Infantry School, for Officers Course. And I passed all three, and they asked me where I'd like to go, and I said Infantry School. I said, cool. And what they did was quite interesting. I don't know if they did this in Grahamstown, is they actually then took you, the candidates who applied for Infantry School were accepted, they put you in a separate platoon, housed separately, treated differently. And it's actually to try and prepare you a bit more. So we ran everywhere we went. We stood when we ate. It was quite trying and taxing and physically demanding. But the South African Defence Force then also had a policy where they wanted to send the boys closer to home, to a base closer to your home. My home was East London. So against my will, I was put on a train with Brent Elliott, who I hadn't met by then, and the two of us were sent on a train down to Grahamstown, 6 Side.
May I interrupt you? Did that mean that you were now off the group, out of the group of guys who were being directed towards infantry school? Were you just sent to another basic infantry training camp for your 2 years of conscription? Well, I mean, so that must have been upsetting to you.
It was, Steve, because when I arrived in Grahamstown, the first thing I asked about is, can I still go to infantry school? And they said to me, no, all our candidates have been selected. You can't. Okay. So I asked, I can't remember who the officer was, and I said to him, well, are there any options open? And he said, you can go and do section leading course.
Okay.
So I did. I went on to section leaders. Actually, we finished the last bit of basics in Charlie, and I think you were Alpha for basics.
Yes.
So, and then from there, we were all then the guys who were selected for section leading were then housed differently, also close to the Charlie lines, and we started our courses.
Perhaps I can interrupt you there. Sorry. So what you're saying is that you arrived in Grahamstown after about 2 or 3 months in Uppington. You arrived at this point and you were lumped into an ordinary infantry company of about 200 men. I was in that company. And it must have been probably a month or two later that they then either sought or nominated volunteers for section leaders course now, which is to be an NCO, a corporal in command of roughly 10 men in a platoon of 30 men. So there would be 3 of you section leaders. And I remember they took you out. There was quite a big group of you guys, and you were separated off to go and do your section leaders training. So how long did that last? Where did it take place? And who instructed you? Who was in charge of that? And how was that experience?
Okay, Steve. Our instructors were the senior instructor in charge of us was Major Cooper, who was ex-British military, had been in the RLI, and then he came to South Africa. And I don't believe he had an officer's rank in the RLI. I think he was a warrant or a sergeant major, and he was made up to an officer. And then his 2IC was Captain Pelser, also Rhodesian, RAR if I'm correct, Rhodesian African Rifles. And those were our 2 main instructors. And then we had obviously the instructors from infantry school, lieutenants and corporals. I had a staff sergeant, Olivacha, who looked after us. We had 3 staffs. The experience, I think, was quite phenomenal, Steve, in the sense that Pelser and Cooper didn't stand on formality, not, the South African rigid discipline. Yeah, discipline, but it wasn't rigid. I can tell you a story about him standing outside at the North Parade Ground, outside the gate there, his hand over his eyes, like he was staring at us, doing fine movement, and this troop walking up to him and saluting. And all Cooper did was this. What the fuck do you want? But that was him.
So to clarify, Pierre, this was now 1981. So both these Rhodesian officers had immense combat experience in the RLI and perhaps elsewhere in the Rhodesian War. Then Rhodesia became Zimbabwe independence in the middle of 1980, and presumably they had left Rhodesia and they had now signed up with the South African Army, possibly as a means to their immigrating here that would allow them, after a period of service, to get passports and citizenship. And you were one of the recruits who fell under these immensely experienced men. I mean, Captain Cooper, Major Cooper, his name has come up frequently over the years. I've heard Rhodesian soldiers talking about him. And in fact, he retired not far from where I live and passed away fairly recently. I never made contact with him again. So yeah, no, continue. So you now have these fine instructors, yeah?
Yeah, so we had these guys. So, as you all remember, second phase was 6 weeks only. So your normal section leading course would be 6 weeks. So that's when you do your mustering. You go do mortars, you go do driving, you go do, well, if you're going to be a platoon medic or just school. We did buddy care, if you remember buddy care.
Yeah.
You learned the basics, And but I think guys like Brian, who I'm sure you'll speak to also, did a far more full intensive course. He wasn't 7 med, but he was proper medic. But anyway, but what happened was during this section course, it was an experimental course which ran for coin and for conventional. So we would do our training for counterinsurgency as section leading platoons. There were 3 of us. Then we would go back to the company, and that's where I ended up in Platoon 1 Alpha Company. The first time was when I was brought there, met Cassie, met Sergeant Van, did my bit with the guys, and then
Cassie was our commanding officer, the platoon officer,
yes. And Sergeant Van Rensburg, Van Heerden, Sergeant Van, Trevor Van Heerden,
our platoon sergeant. And these guys were both permanent force soldiers who'd been in the army for 3 or 4 years prior to us. Hard men. They'd been up to the war for a couple of tours of duty, and they were now tasked with training us. Right, so you fell in with the platoon, that platoon one. I was in that platoon as well, and that's obviously where we first met. That must have been sort of, I don't know, kind of two-thirds of the way through 1981, and you're now section leader. Yeah. So Pierre, how was the course? Tough? Was your training good? What sorts of things did you do?
It was tough, Steve. It was tough because it was based around the physical side of it. And Cooper, as well as Pelser, believed that if you're going to be leading men, you should be leading from the front. So you fit. You've got to be fit. They want you to be fit, you know. But they weren't unnecessarily rough on you, in a sense that if you couldn't make like the 2,4 in 9 minutes, they wouldn't make you run it 3 times, like I had to do at Charlie Company the one time. It's another story. But anyway, yeah. So you were fit, and because they had an unconventional look at war during the time in Rhodesia, you know, they dealt both of them dealt with the SAS as well as with the Scouts, because the scale of the war, as you alluded to earlier, was of such a nature that the SAS and the Scouts couldn't do those big external raids just by themselves. So RAR troops, RLI troops were all involved. So they got a feel for that sort of how that war works. And they taught us some of it, not all of it. They taught us what they felt was pertinent towards us. So we learned those skills in a big way. They were very strong on things like map reading, being able to use your compass properly, know where you are at all times, how to set up a proper security, all of this, which is basic soldiering, but the emphasis was more on that than on sometimes, I think, and you can tell me what some of the infantry instructors were teaching a normal infantry platoon. I think a lot of them, I don't think Cassie and Van were like that, but there were some platoon commanders and platoon sergeants around that were very strong on discipline more than, you know, you've got to do it this way. Where Cooper and Pelser will say, this is the military doctrine by the South African Defence Force, but try this. You know, setting up ambushes, patrolling, all of that thing. Yeah, just a small thing, and we never did it because we didn't patrol much in section strength, was that the Scouts used to sleep in single file. Why? Because that's how the freedom fighters, they sleep in a line. They don't sleep
alongside each other, like sardines.
Yeah, in a single file almost. You know, also, or in a straight line like that, as an extended line where you patrolled in a box formation type thing. But they never slept in a circle. So, you know, things like that. And what that does is it then, if you're being followed or tracked, these guys might think, okay, well, these are our people. So small little things that they taught us. But when you go back to, and again, it's no disrespect to Cassie and to Van, they were taught a certain way to do it, and that's how we did it, mostly. And it does work. It does work. Little things, and we can get to that later on. I'll tell you my experiences at Golf Ops, and Alan Vayak will affirm this, some of the stuff that we'll talk about later. But this is now about the training and how we did it. So,
well now, how were these two Rhodesian officers received by the conscripts, and particularly by the Afrikaans guys? Because we know from what the Rhodesians have said that there were difficulties for them assimilating into the South African Defence Force. The two armies were very different, and the two wars were very different, and not many of them lasted beyond the contract that they had signed up for, Rhodesians coming in. And, you know, I instinctively had big respect for both of these guys, knowing what they had gone through. But from the Afrikaans guys, was there that appreciation as well?
Steve, definitely. Look, you've also got to understand the Afrikaner and his psyche. You know, he's grown up with discipline his whole life at school. If you were stoked, you got bliksem. You went to the headmaster. So those were figures of authority. They didn't abuse authority. They taught us things that even to today I can remember. I can remember some of the stuff that Cooper and Pelser said to us, and they treated us with respect. Although you knew the rank and you responded to the rank, they treated us with respect. And I think the Afrikaans guys, myself included, I respected them tremendously, and I soaked up everything they wanted to teach me because I knew it was of value. There was no extraneous nonsense being shoved at you. It was pared down to, this is what you need to know to survive this and to get through.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've come to an interesting point, another topic, and that is, so much has been made about the antagonism between the English guys and the Afrikaans guys in the South African army, you know. And you've got people who say it was severe, and the English guys felt like they were picked on, and they are sometimes insulting or disparaging of the Afrikaans guys. And, you know, there's this whole thing that's been spoken about for years and years. And so now, I mean, these officers were experiencing it themselves. So it is interesting to hear that there was this general pervasive respect for them. And I must say, in my experience, this gulf between the English and Afrikaans speakers is too much is made of it. Ultimately, we were forged into the same army, into the same mentality, a fighting mentality. And while there might have been antagonism said in jest here and there wasn't that much in it. And certainly out there in the bush, when the bullets were flying, the guys came together and fought as one. And so that, I mean, that's my feeling about it. I'm sure that you concur. And so that leads us through to the end of your section leader training. You now came back to platoon 1. I remember very well the day that the 3 of you arrived. You were now corporals, you know, with the 2 stripes on your arms.
6 of us.
Yep.
You can't discount, right? Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Was it?
Sorry?
Okay, at any rate, but I remember clearly yourself and Alan Hewer, now also a corporal, and Brent, and yeah, a couple of the other chaps. And I must say, from our side, you know, we had been going on with our infantry training out there in the rolling hills of Grahamstown. It was tough, yeah, from my perspective. And, you know, I was a fit kid. As I said, I had been in Rhodesia prior to that, and out on a farm for a couple of months. And they had made sure that I was fit. And I struggled with the fitness. Of course, I noticed how the instructors brought us through up a sort of ladder of fitness, increasing our fitness in measured chunks. They didn't just immediately drive us into the ground physically, but at each step it went up a serious step, the fitness. From PT, of course we did a lot of drill, you know, which has its own fitness. And then PT, and then running around in the bush, and then the runs became longer, you know, and the obstacle course, and then the route marches out to the shooting range outside Six Side, which must have been back. I guess that was 5 kilometers away or so.
It's about 6 Ks, yeah.
6 Ks, and then of course, you did not do 5 Ks or 6 Ks there and 6 Ks back. You know, at the end of the day, you done 30 Ks because there was a lot of run up that hill and yach you off here and chase you here and there. Yeah, I found that very onerous. And I found also that a lot of the guys just couldn't cut it. You know, it was too much for them. And it was at those early days, within the first few months, we were now in about a 9-month training cycle before they sent us off to the war. It was early on that the instructors started separating out the guys who they could see were perhaps more athletic and who took to the fitness and whose motivation was better, and who would wind up being the foot soldiers in the war, as opposed to the other guys who perhaps weren't as robust and who would be better suited to being pen pushers or chefs, and they started, you know, ferreting guys out. So if I think back to it, probably of our intake, perhaps you agree, probably about the third guys of the guys, 1/3 were sent off to do other duties and didn't wind up patrolling in the bush. Does that stat kind of sit with you?
I think you're right, Steve. It might even be more because, you know, at the end of the day, your logistics and your support chain is quite long. And it's quite it takes a lot of people to just clothe, arm, feed, and transport one single soldier. So, yeah, and I agree with you. I think in an infantry training battalion like we were, probably 2/3 would remain infantrymen, but then the others would be absorbed into the other arms, like you said, driving, cook, clerk, company clerk, whatever they would be mustered into. So yeah,
and I think motorists and medics and people working in the pay office, and they seem to go all over the place. And many of the guys were sent off to bases closer to home. Somehow they managed to, you know, get back to the castle in Cape Town or to Natal Command in Durban, and they had fishing 2 years. I don't know what. I mean, we had a guy who was a hairdresser. He was sent home. And some of the guys seem to wangle things from home. I don't know how they did it, but anyhow. So you arrived back, and you and the other guys as section leaders. And I remember as a troop and as your former friend, you know, platoon mate from just a month before, now having to deal with the uncomfortable issue of you being in charge of us and having rank. And there was I'd say there was a sort of simmering resentment amongst us about this, and we weren't at all keen to listen to you guys. It took some time for us to adapt to your authority, but at the same time, and it's not particular to you, it's of all you section leaders, at the same time, I felt that you guys were very guarded as well, and you were slow to exercise your authority. You didn't want to come in heavy-handed. But certainly by the time the training had ended, by the end of the 9 months, you were, you know, your section leader group was very much in command of the guys and were respected by the guys, you know, by the time we went off to the war. I mean, how did that play out from your side? What was your view of that?
I think exactly the same, Steve. You know, you get brought up to a position of authority, and while you're doing training, you still got your instructors. Like when we came back to the company or the platoons, we still had the instructors who were running the show. All you had to do is make sure that your 10 or the 8 guys with you executed it. So when we started doing, or once we came back on a permanent basis, you could feel the guys, because when we'd spent like time together in a bungalow, talking to each other as like mates, you know, so now, how do I react to you, seeing you? And do I want you to salute, or not salute me, but strike me? Yeah. And do I want you to call me Corporal? But if you don't do that, then I feel that you might not respect the authority that I do represent. So, you know, as Dick Winters said to Sobel, said, we salute the rank, we don't salute the person.
Yes, yes.
So, you know, and but I think all of us wanted more also to be accepted back as being, yes, we're a little bit different now because we have those camel bites on our shoulders, but we're not really that much more different, because you and I are going to go through the same things in 2 weeks' time when we get on that flossy, we fly up there, you know. And all I've been given is maybe a little bit more training, how to operate the radio, how to read the compass better, how to do the map reading, which I think all of you did anyway, to a degree. But, you know, so those skills, I think also, once the guys realized that we were there to be more as a assistant to the platoon commanders, I believe that sort of resentment fell away. And I think by the time we left for the operational area, we were a unit. You know, my section was a unit within a unit. So we had Steve, section leader 1 for section 1, myself section 2, and Alan for 3, and then Jimmy Gomes with Steve. I had Raymond Suter or Cuter to start with, and then Brent was with Alan. And you know, I think,
of course, I wasn't in your section. I was in Alan Hewer's section, and won't say too much about Alan now. Hopefully, we'll get him, one of us, to be able to interview him. But,
is he in Cape Town at the moment?
I'm not sure where he is, but I just remember this hulking, enormous man who had already played Currie Cup rugby before he arrived in the army. He was a locker, playing for Border, and he played for, I think he also had a game for Transvaal, or I'm not certain, but enormous guy.
We'll get to that story, the Transvaal story now.
enormous guy, and with a short fuse, and very short. You and I both fell foul of his temper.
Yep.
Another story for another time. And much respected Eastern Cape guy who went on to play serious rugby afterwards, and played against the All Blacks a few times, and played in France and so on. And today a great friend of both of ours. But yeah, so I fell under Alan. So while I might have had any sort of simmering resentment, I was not going to reveal it to Alan. Yeah. So perhaps, Pierre, we can now go through to wind up our training, right through to the end of our 9 months. As you say, we did various phases of training. I got the feeling by the end of our training that we were very well prepared. We were fit. We had been welded into a good fighting unit. We had done a lot of platoon drills out in the bush outside Grahamstown, where we simulated various contact situations with the enemy. We did that bush alley training with target popping up and you had to shoot at the target. So it was live ammunition training. And I remember us doing simulating contacts where, should the enemy walk, we walk into them and they're on the right. Then I remember us, the officer now, relaying sections around and moving us left and right, pulling one section in reserve, and formulating spontaneous battle plans to deal with this threat on the right. And then we would try it on the left and in front of us, and what if the guys are behind us? And we went through all these practices of how we would behave when the time came for combat. And inevitably, as a troop, in one of the sections, that meant running, and running over there, and running over there, and of course it's full kit and webbing, and it's the middle of it was summer by then in Grahamstown, and oh man, but we were fit, and there we were with our full kits and a lot of sleeping in the bush and being messed around. They seemed to ease up on us as we approached those 9 months. There was a lot less sort of saluting type authority and shouting at us. There was a feeling between us and the rank, between yourselves and the permanent force instructors, that we're all in this together, and we've become a tight unit. And the only thing that remains now is for us to be tested in the war, and that was about to happen. And I remember they took a platoon photograph of us, which I think was opposite the sick bay at the sort of logistics place. Yep. I still have, and they sent us home for one final period of leave for pass, which I think was probably about 4 or 5 days. And then we had to report back. We had been told at some point that we were going up to the border for a 6-month trip. And I remember telling that to my dad, and he was disbelieving. He said, no one goes up for 6 months. They're all 3-month tours, But we'd been told that, and I assured him that that was the case. He was like, well, okay, we'll see. And I remember leaving home to return now to Grahamstown before being sent off to the... In fact, I'm jumping ahead of things. We were not sent for 6 months. We first were sent up to the Limpopo River for 2 months, 2 or 3 months.
2 months. Yeah.
Limpopo River, the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, where, well, you and I were in the same platoon. We spent a lot of time standing guard on the catwalk below the bridge and on the bridge above, and then also patrolling up and down the river and interacting with the farmers. Anything you want to add about the remainder of our training, and then move on to talking about the bike bridge experience?
I think, Steve, you've touched on all of it. Just a small aside, an interesting thing is that we got a small infusion of guys who had not made BAT's course, the paratrooper course. Marcus, Johan van Deventer, Koos van Sail, I think Fadi as well. I'm not 100% sure. And they all ended up in my section. And the only thing I can remember about that is when they ended up in my section, I thought, screw this, these are going to be way fitter than me. So I'm going to have to prove myself all over again. Okay. I remember running like the clappers, like coughing blood almost, because I was not going to let these guys get to a place ahead of me. But that's it. But they did fit in extremely well and extremely quickly with us. And they didn't come with any A's and graces and nonsense. like you would expect sometimes. I mean, you know, we had some incidents, I think, later on, and we can touch on that in the operational area, where we did interact with the bats. And yes, they were good, but he's an infantryman that falls out of the sky, jumps out of a perfectly good functional aircraft.
Yeah, and you had, what I remember about those guys coming back was they had all been returned to unit from parachute battalion because of injuries. You know, they were twisted ankles and they were this and that. And some of them had given it a really good go. They'd fallen off in the early stage of their jump course. They'd got through the PD course. They were well on track to being paratroopers. And it must have been a severe disappointment for them to come back now to us. But
for sure,
they did, and I don't remember any bitterness or rancor. They just slotted right back in. Very good guys. Anyhow,
they were actually, and they were a credit to themselves and to the platoon eventually. So I think, Steve, no, there's not much I want to add about the training itself. But yes, we initially we went up by train. You remember? To
Beitbridge to Messina. We caught
Messina by train, yes. And I remember
Grahamstown, Grahamstown to Messina.
We departed Grahamstown, Messina, yes. And just a small thing, I don't know if you remember this, but the medics came around on the second night and they gave us quinine tablets, 6 of them.
That's right.
And I was lucky because having grown up in Namibia or Southwest Africa then, we used to take the stuff and you drank it because it's as bitter as ore. So the medic walked into the compartment and he said to us, "You got to chew these for maximum effect." And I looked at him and said, "Okay, I will." And he walked out. And the guys with me chewed their tablets. Okay. And so you had, like, what happened is because it's very dry, so it dries out to the saliva in your mouth, and the stuff would stick into their teeth. And like for a day or two after, these pockets of quinine would like dissolve, and all of a sudden you could see in the guy's face he's tasting his quinine all over again.
Why did you not take yours?
I drank it. I drank them.
Okay.
No, I took them, but I drank them. My dad had caught me out when I was 13 years old. With the same trick. Okay. But yeah, so we went up our train, and then we ended up in the camp in Messina, where it's quite interesting. I think you and Cassie and the guys, some of the guys, Alan, I believe, played some rugby while we were there.
Yes.
And we also did platoon patrols, but we also did a lot of section patrols, which was quite nice because then you got to know your section apart from the platoon, because during training you do get to know them. You get to know them as individuals and as people, but within the ambit of the platoon itself. Now it's you, and I think Raymond was still 2IC to me then, and it was just the 2 of us and the 8 other guys. That sounds wrong, but the section itself. So your interaction and your dealing and your recognition of how the strengths and the weaknesses of people and of yourself come into a sharper focus, and you learn. And I think we were very blessed that we had that period of time that we could sharpen up ourselves and the sections individually before we went up to the real sharp end in Novemberland.
And the training
was great. And then
here, the actual patrolling, the physical aspect of it, did you find it taxing? It was a very different countryside that we were suddenly in. It was a much hotter. It was sort of, there were hills. It was very rocky. I remember they gave us tin food, which was really inadequate. Was it taxing for you?
Steve, no. I'll be honest with you, and maybe because I'm not as intelligent, or I don't think things through a lot. You know, it was another day. And you got tired. Look, I mean, you get tired and you sleep well at night, and you finish your tin food within 2 days, and then you steal from the farmer. But I didn't find it that taxing.
The farmers were good to us. Every now and then they were slach a sheep, and we'd have a big braai out there, and it was actually a beautiful part of the world. It still is, I imagine. It was remote, and it was unpopulated. I think they had sent us up there partially because those were the early days when they were now first getting Umkhonto we Sizwe guerrillas coming through from Zimbabwe. And we were supposed to now intercept them or look for any sort of evidence of them. We never did. It was very early days, and I don't think many ever came through down that route. So it was a relaxed period for us. It was actually a nice, soft introduction to the real war in Southwest Africa.
Correct.
It was a buffer period. I remember that standing guard on the bridge was quite an experience. And coming face to face with the Zimbabwe soldiers. You know, we literally on that catwalk would walk right up to them. There was a sandbag in the middle. Little sandbag wall.
Sandbag wall.
And we had been warned that that we should be wary of these guys and that we weren't to communicate with them. And because those guys then, they were a year into their own independence of Zimbabwe. So I got the feeling that we were sort of the last outpost, you know, the last bastion of colonialism, if you want to call it, facing the whole of Africa north of us at this bridge.
We were, you know.
And they were very smartly turned out in their camouflage uniforms and their AK-47s. And eventually, after a while, we did have a few cursory words with them, but I think they had received similar instructions their side not to talk to us. But Zimbabwe was considered very much the enemy, although we weren't in an active war with them at that stage.
No.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, Steve. Look, I think they were seemed to be the enemy because at that stage, Mbeki was a house guest of Mugabe's, and the ANC had been pressed into assisting the troops on the eastern side to fight against the Rhodesian security services forces. So the payback for ANC and Mkonte was that they actually had a safe base to operate from. And there was the one incident that, I don't know if you were with us, we were away playing, but Cassie was there, is that we went out on a sweep at 2 o'clock in the morning. And we were given the orders, everything. I still remember that night before we went out watching Karen Carpenter with her brother on TV. Anyway, we went out and we had intelligence and had information that there was going to be 3 MK guys sleeping in this one shed on the farmer's property in the ski. We executed the sweep, and there was nobody there. And we went back to base, and they're based in Messina, and I'd just fallen asleep. Cassie woke me up. They'd been on the next farm, and the farmer had gone out early hunting, and he bumped into them. Shots were exchanged, and they ran, and we jumped in biffles, and we actually went to the farm. They weren't there. Then we drove down the cut line along the Limpopo. Is it Limpopo? Yes, the Limpopo. Yeah, and this the first biffle had a tracker, I think, on it, sitting on the engine, and he saw the tracks where they crossed, and the only contact we had was this. So they came to a screeching halt over a rise, and the biffle behind it connected. So there was contact. But that was the only real sort of excitement, if you can call it that.
Yeah, I remember for us, maybe the same incident. I remember Sergeant Van Heerden was driving the buffalo. He never had a license.
He was.
There was a whole.
That was him. Yeah.
Anyhow, so I mean, we could spend a whole hour just talking on that experience as well. For my part, it was a nice introduction to the war. But being a city boy, it was my first long extended experience in the bush, so it was quite trying.